Hello and welcome to the Whisper in the Shadow podcast. This is the interview series, and these are the true stories of current and former real-life undercover cops. I'm Michael Bates, and I was a police officer for 15 years in one of Australia's state police forces. I was also an undercover cop for over 2 years, and you've been following my true stories in my original podcast. Well, rather, I was Michael Bates. So, full disclosure, Michael is not actually my real name. It was my covert identity I used on most of my operations. Everyone has a notion of what undercover policing is all about. Whether you call them a narc, a covert operative, a dog or a UC, most people seem to confuse plainclothes police or detectives with being undercover. There is a very big difference though. Most plainclothes police detectives don't wear a uniform. That way, they aren't as obtrusive in public. Being undercover is completely different. You become immersed in the world of your targets. When you're an undercover police officer though, you are the evidence, and you are the reason someone gets convicted of their crimes. That is both exciting and dangerous. Whilst you have heard my true stories of what it's really like to be undercover cop, I want to give a voice to all those living amongst us, unseen and unnoticed, who have put their life on the line being an undercover cop. I want to let them tell their real-life stories. The interview series is just that, an opportunity for current and former undercover police to tell their stories, good and bad, to give you, the listener, a glimpse into something you will likely never get to experience. So, let's go and meet our next guest. This podcast includes conversations and discussions about trauma that some people may find triggering. If you or anyone you know is experiencing things discussed here, please contact an organisation like Beyond Blue or Lifeline and talk to someone. Today I'm chatting with Keith Banks, who is a former police officer, covert operative, current author of at least 2 books that I know of, speaker and advocate. Good morning, Keith. Welcome to the podcast. How are you today?
G'day, Michael. I'm very well, mate. Always enjoy these sort of conversations and meeting interesting people myself.
That's good. Look, thank you for agreeing to join the podcast and for agreeing to have a chat about your undercover experiences firstly, but obviously we'll talk about your time in the police and your books and what you're currently doing now. I guess I want to start with getting an understanding or a brief overview of what you've done in your career to date.
Okay. First 20 years of my working life, I was a Queensland police officer from 1975 to 95. I started as a junior cadet, so I joined the year I turned 17, 2 years in the academy, then sworn member. I resigned in 1995, not for any other reason than I was just emotionally broken. I had no idea how broken I was until many years later. But I just needed to leave because I loved the job, worked in a variety of areas in the job, and we'll obviously touch on those later. But had I stayed, I don't know what the result would have been. Probably not good. I was very fortunate. I was approached and offered a job in the corporate sector. So I took that up and I worked for Coles Myer, the then largest retailer in the Southern Hemisphere, for 5.5 years. They had a study program, so I did a mature age MBA, which they paid for and put me through and so on. Brilliant program. I then I got a bit restless and moved into the supply chain for security. I managed a Victorian security company, worked across a couple of areas there. I went back to Borders Books and Music in retail as the Asia Pacific loss and risk manager. Then the Borders business model was folding worldwide because they had a Kodak moment where they didn't actually take notice of emerging technology. Sadly. So I then moved into a general management role with a security organisation across Australia and New Zealand. I was made redundant from that role after a couple of years, and that was a bit of a shock. That's what happens in the corporate jungle. Did a little consultancy for a while, and then I ran another startup company for a fixed-term contract of 18 months, which again was still working across Australia and New Zealand. Then I was approached to apply for a role with the Housing Industry Association as the Deputy Director for Victoria. Picked that up. Worked there for 7 years, I think. And then my last corporate role was Chief Operations Officer for the Real Estate Institute of Victoria. That position was made redundant a couple of years ago. This time I was very happy for that to happen because it enabled me to do what I do now. And in the meantime, I'd written 2 books, and you're right, I'm working on a third. But I'd written 2 books that were published by Allen & Unwin, the largest publisher in Australia. Yep. So I was pretty flattered about that. That enabled me to move into a network of public speaking and advocacy for mental health and post-traumatic stress disorder recovery. Not that you can ever fully recover from it, but as someone who's suffered with it for 3 decades undiagnosed, my platform now is to use as much opportunity, influence as I can across many networks and drag the conversation about mental health out of the darkness into the light where it belongs.
Very true. It's something that I grew up I grew up being told that it's something you don't talk about, and especially in the police. It was always, if the minute you mention something about it, it's like, you need to leave type thing. And I dare say your experiences in COVID, which we'll come to, were probably worse than mine in the sense of support in regards to the organisational support and those sorts of things. And that wry smile gives it away, definitely.
There was no support, mate. There was absolutely zero. So,
how did you end up in Victoria? Is it that you like an AFL team better down there? Or?
No, I'm one of those rare males, mate. I don't watch football. I prefer to do stuff. So, sorry to all those who do watch football. That's all good. No, mate. I married a Victorian. I've written about how I met my wife in my second book. It's she was a serving Victorian detective when I met her. Yep. I was running the wing clipping tactical or strategic intel arm of criminal intelligence working on outlaw motorcycle gangs. So I happened to be in Victoria. Okay. So I met her. We had a long-distance relationship. She then later moved to Brisbane. She left the police and moved to Brisbane. After I resigned from the cops, I think I had another 12 months or something. And then I was promoted or offered a promotion to Melbourne. So she wanted to come back, and I was happy to move. It
seemed like the right thing at the right time.
Yeah, and look, I just needed to break my world. I needed to get away from things that were triggering me and, all of that environment. I saw that as a great opportunity, so I've been here ever since.
Funny, I can relate. I did exactly the same thing, but I came back to Queensland. So you've written 2 books. You're in the middle of writing a third. What was the impetus for writing the first book? How did that come about?
11 years after I resigned, I had a major, probably a breakdown, or very close to it, a major anxiety attack, quite crippling. And I started seeing a counsellor. I had no idea about counselling. And it was 2006. So, I went through a stage of seeing counsellors, trying to find the right one, knowing full well that I had issues, not understanding what they were, all of that. So, off and on for the next probably 10 years or so, in and out of counselling offices, no regularity, trying to probably fix myself, I guess, through exercise and as much research as I could. Not having a great deal of success because I still, drank way too much. I was angry. I was withdrawn. I was all of the classic symptoms of PTSD. I started writing a couple of chapters to give to my daughters because they were then older. They'd grown up with me in that whole world of post-traumatic stress disorder. And it's a disorder for a reason. It's named a disorder for a reason. If it affects your life longer than 4 to 6 weeks, it's a disorder. So I wanted to write something to them when I was getting better. Now, I have to clarify, I was never physically violent. I was never mentally abusive. I was just withdrawn. I was just, had anger about little things that would flash to the surface.
And I think that's the thing with, sorry to interrupt, I think that's the thing with PTSD, that most people will see it as outbursts of anger that become violent, whereas for a vast majority of people that suffer with it, it's small things like snapping at the dog or that sort of thing, which yes is a violent reaction, but it's seen as, in society, it's probably seen as okay, well, that's just an everyday reaction, and that's what it's put down to. Things have just gotten too much on that particular day, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
And there's no understanding across that a number of these little things add up to maybe something like PTSD.
Yeah, look, and again, book number 2, mate, I've written about how someone told me I might have PTSD and I didn't believe him because I thought that was only for people who'd done really dangerous stuff. And in hindsight, I'd been in gun battles, I'd lost a mate, all of that stuff, which is really dangerous stuff. So I started writing. I wanted to give the girls something to help them understand why I had been like I had been for so long. Even I didn't write chronologically. I just started writing some things and gave it to one of my daughters to read, and she loved it. Gave it to a couple of friends that I knew that I trusted, and gave it to a guy I trained with in my karate dojo. All of them came back very quickly, and the conversation was, that was excellent. Where's more? We want to read more. About your life. So I just started writing, mate, and. The first one I did with a co-author. You can call him a ghostwriter, I guess, but I'll be nice and say a co-author because, he helped me refine my writing style. He wanted to write creative fiction, and we clashed about that because I wanted the book to be raw and authentic. He's a little bit more flowery in his prose than I am. And you'll see the difference between the first and the second book. The second book is pretty raw. Not that it's badly written. I'm told it's actually better than the first, but I didn't have any flowery descriptions of stuff. I talked about life as it was, and it was pretty raw. So that's why. So, and what happened after that, Michael, was that they were published. The first one was published Whale, and another one, as I said. A lot of media, a lot of great response. And then we had the infamous lockdown in Victoria where our esteemed, and I use the word sarcastically, Premier Andrews decided that we're all going to die. And so he locked us down like, Starlag 17. It was shocking. But during those lockdowns with brief moments of freedom, we were forced to work from home. So I just started writing a second. And just, again, this one was chronological for the most part, but I just started writing it, and I had a letter from the publisher or an email, that came from the publisher who, this grandfather of publishing, as I call him, very funny man. He said, "So Keith, I hope you're enjoying lockdown. What's happening with your second book?" And I'd written about, I think, 3 chapters or 4 chapters at that stage, so I sent them back to him. And literally within 3 or 4 days, he'd send an email back with an advance payment and a contract for the second one. I'm like, wow. So
that's pretty good.
Very happy with it. Yeah, I'm very flattered. I'm very flattered and very very honoured that they picked me up as an author.
Why do you think people like to read, and in my position, listen to, watch, whatever it is, absorb, consume stories about policing or undercover policing?
I think true crime. I think the true crime genre, whether it be written or audio or visual, scares people a little bit. And because you and I both know there's a whole netherworld out there that the average person never sees, I think it scares them a little bit, and I think they want to maybe know what they're missing, and they're happy that they're missing it. There's also a component of healthy, normal human curiosity about the evil that people can do to each other. A variety of reasons, when I worked in the book industry and Borders, the true crime genre, the largest demographic was women. I think women,
I've heard that a number of times. Just on that Borders thing, do you think somewhere along the line that planted the seed of this writing idea?
It may well have. Although, on reflection, my favourite subject when I was at school was English, and I enjoyed writing then. I enjoyed reading great writers. I had a pretty ordinary childhood from a domestic abuse perspective, so my escape from that was the library. I used to go and spend hours in the library just reading as much as I could, because for me, books were an escape and an introduction to other worlds that you would never experience. So when I, always wanted to write something, but like most of us, I had imposter syndrome. I didn't think that my stories were valuable enough or anyone would want to read them. Having said that, mate, perhaps like you, I was great at dinner parties. I always had entertaining stories. People would say, tell me another one, tell me another one, tell me another one. And you collect them over a career.
Yeah.
Policing is, I think, probably 95% boring paperwork and 5% sheer terror. And the sheer terror part is what people want to hear about.
Yeah, and you're right. Dinner parties are always the sort of thing, and the imposter syndrome is quite funny because this podcast, not so much the interview parts of it, but the other part of it, telling the stories, grew out of a desire to probably write a book. And I wrote the book and went, you know what? That's shit. Maybe I'll turn it. And I went, no one's actually, because it was that period where all the bookstores were closing down. It's like, no one's going to read a book. Yeah. Maybe I'll turn it into a movie. So I pivoted and put it into a screenplay. Life happened and other things happened, and I went, meh. Then I've come back and I've gone, look, I really want to get this out, and I'll delve into why I want to get this out, because I'll ask you some of these same questions a little later on. But it was like, how are people consuming this sort of information at the moment? And that's how I came up with the podcast. Short, the stories can be short, punchy, get it out there, and people can then listen to it as well. When I started, I thought I'll get 100 listens. If I can get 100 listens over the entire series of the podcast, I think I pitched myself 15 stories. I'll be happy. Job done. We're up around 3,000 now, and I'm just sort of going, oh my God, people actually like this. It's the sort of thing that you sit there and think to yourself, no one's going to want to listen to this, no one's going to know this. But when you do it, as you have with your book, you've written the first one, and then the publishers come back to you and said, what's happening with the second one? It's like, okay, I'm not that imposter that I think I am. People want to listen to this.
And I think also, mate, it shows the human side of policing. You and I both know the emotional impact and toll it takes on human beings. A lot of people's only experience with policing is getting a traffic ticket, unfortunately. But there's a lot more to being a cop than that. It can take a massive human and emotional toll. On the other side of the coin, it's an occupation where you can genuinely help protect people from predators, bring some justice to society, as cliched as that sounds, and actually get some bloody good outcomes.
Yep.
So I wanted to write about the price you pay. And I said to my publisher initially, look, even if we only have one book, or the first book rather, when people finish reading it, if they close the last page and go, holy shit, there's more than I ever thought about being a cop. And it helps diminish the imposter syndrome when I read a lot of reviews.
Yep.
Because authors should always read reviews of their work, good or bad, good and bad rather. And the amount of people who've spoken about what they've learnt and the appreciation they now have for police is great. And also those who are either veteran police or military veterans or relatives of both that have reviewed it and said, it's helped them understand more and more about how their family members have been and why, then that means just as much, if not more, to me.
Yeah, and I look at it as I think something you said earlier is that police are human. They have the same emotions, feelings, reactions, and those sorts of things that any other person listening to this podcast has throughout the day. They see a lot more and have a lot more happen that affect that, but the expectation is that they're not supposed to show it. And people possibly don't understand some of the things that happen that do affect, the personalities of people who are police. And the books and hopefully this podcast and this interview series with people who've done the job, people learn to understand that it's not just writing a traffic ticket. That's a basic thing what police do. Police do things that are really psychologically damaging, and the start of getting better around that is talking about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I spend a deal of my time now doing corporate presentations about mental fitness, resilience, recovery, understanding, and authenticity. And the first step to recovery and the first step to changing attitudes is to have authentic conversations. And I know we're probably getting a bit off topic, but if someone out there is and who is listening to this is struggling, the first thing that they need to understand is they're not alone in this. I thought I was the only one that felt that way for 30 years, and it was horrible. So you're not by yourself. You're not alone. If you have someone that you can open up to, then do it. If you are the person that's being opened up to, shut the hell up and don't try and solve anything. All people who are suffering want to have is someone who will listen to them without any judgment, without any solution provision, without any of that. They just want someone who can sit in the morass or sit in the mud with them and be there with them and then let them move on. Yeah.
Yep.
So it's the first step, but that's a whole different conversation, mate. That'll take me,
It is. I guess the only thing I would probably add to that is that you don't need to understand, you just need to listen.
Exactly right. Yeah. Yep.
So, all right. So before I move on, now you've got your own, obviously, website. Well, where can the people listening or watching or listening find your books? Where can they buy them? That sort of stuff. If you can give a plug for your website and that.
So my website is keithbanks.com.au. Very easy to remember. I keep a stock of books and I'm more than happy to personally inscribe them to whoever would like to buy them. So you jump onto that website. It's a bit clunky at the moment. It's actually being updated as we speak. But it's easy to find the books and you purchase that way. Whatever message you want on them, you let me know. And I have them all sent out. Secondly, Booktopia. Booktopia is subject to the whims of Australia Post, but they always have stock.
Yes, as I found out.
Amazon, the book's available on Kindle, ebooks, Kindle, and Audible. A lot of bookstores still stock them. The product life cycle of books, though, is around probably 2 years, I suppose. But if they're not in a bookstore, I'd strongly suggest Booktopia.
And what are the names of the titles of the books?
Yeah, the first one is Drugs, Guns and Lies. It's about my time as an undercover cop in Queensland's bad old days. And the second is Gun to the Head. So it's my story about the impact and aftermath of a tactical operations policeman, the forerunner to Queensland CERT. So, and Gun to the Head is both physical and metaphorical. So that's the one that was number 2 that I'm. You shouldn't have favourites, like you shouldn't have favourite
like children.
But I've got, so that's my favourite book. Yeah.
Okay. So all those details will be in the description at the bottom underneath where you're listening or watching this particular podcast, and your website address will be in there as well. So if anyone wants to buy a book or just find out more about Keith, you can go to keithbanks.com.au. Okay, so what did you want to be when you were growing up?
Look, as I touched on before, mate, I had a pretty challenging childhood. So my stepfather was one of those generations of Australians, all too prevalent, that drank too much and beat his wife and harassed and, terrorised his family. So I wanted to, I can probably remember from the time I was 8 or 9, I wanted to do something that protected people from that, or protected people from predators, or protected people from bullies, essentially. So the police force was always running around in my mind. I also, as I got older, went to high school, I joined the Army Cadets. And in those days, the Army Cadet system taught you how to survive, shoot, navigate, all of the fun stuff. That's how I learned to shoot. And also the discipline was something that I just fell straight into. I loved it. I loved the whole sense of camaraderie. I loved the positive male role models who were teachers at school, so it doesn't take a shrink to figure out why. I was really attracted to the ADF, and in fact, that was probably my primary focus through my high school life. We moved around a lot from town to town, by the way. So where I ended up in a town near Townsville in Queensland, the local Army Cadet coordinator was a Vietnam veteran who was a warrant officer class 2. Amazing bloke, tough as nails, and almost took me under his wing, I suppose, because he knew what was happening in my home life. He was getting me ready to apply for Duntroon, which is now ADFA. And he was convinced I would have been accepted, and I probably would have. I was one of those nerdy kids who just realised that I was academically bright, and I put all self-deprecation aside. So that was my escape path, and I knew if I did well at school, I could go anywhere. I could get away from that whole environment. Around year 10, I think, we had a police recruiter who came to school and talked about the academy, the fact that you, in those days, could do years 11 and 12 as a paid cadet, another 12 months of police training, and then be sworn. And I looked at that and thought, and I guess it rekindled all of my childhood thoughts about policing. I always saw policing as a noble career. I was never interested in how much it was being paid. It was paid pretty ordinary in those days, ordinarily.
It was paid pretty ordinary when I joined too, to be perfectly honest.
It's not bad now, but, it wasn't about the money for me. It was about doing something I thought was worthwhile. And situation at home got so bad that I couldn't stay for another year. So, in order to apply for Duntroon, I would have had to have finished year 12. So at the end of year 11, it was just I just had to get out. And so I applied for the police force cadet system, went through in hindsight, I wouldn't say rigorous, but certainly a couple of interviews that were fairly pointed. So it wasn't I wasn't a shoo-in at all. But then I was accepted when I was on an Army Cadet under officer training camp. So came back home. My mum had signed the papers. My stepfather hated police, so he was against the whole idea. And again, I've written about that in my first book. And I've been able to do that because my mum sadly passed away some years ago, and so did he. So I think had she been alive, I wouldn't have been as forthright with those chapters. But certainly it had to be said. Because it shows motivation, I guess. So that was my thing. Was my escape, and came to the academy just before I turned 17, a couple of months before I turned 17. Was
the academy, was that a 12-month cadetship in those days?
No, I did year 12, and then I did another 12 months as a third-year cadet.
Okay.
So year 12 was a combination of academic and police studies, PTI, yelling, screaming. It was pretty brutal in those days, and it was designed that way, I think, across all academies to weed out those who were serious and those who weren't, and don't really have a problem with it.
It's quite funny because when I went through, I was a Muppet. Now you'll know what that is. Mm-hmm. And we were sitting in a class one day, and one of the instructors, someone was playing up. One of the instructors said, 3 years ago, I'd make you run around the oval with a chair over your head, but I'm not allowed to do it anymore. Yeah. And so we've all gone, there was 60 of us in the class, we've all gone, go on, do it. So he did. And one of the recruits is doing laps with the chair over his head. Anyway, the lecturer got called into the I think it's a superintendent that runs the academy, see the superintendent, and got reprimanded. Because, we were making someone run around. You don't do those sorts of things. And we're all sitting there going, oh, my God, you're supposed to have self-discipline. You're supposed to be disciplined. Making someone run around the oval with a chair over their head is deemed to be wrong. You've got to learn there are consequences for your actions.
Look, in my time, mate, we ran around the oval for whatever transgressions with a 303, an empty, unloaded, but an old 303
That's probably smart.
Above our heads, and those things are heavy. So we were made to duck walk on our haunches for 50 metres up, 50 metres back. Your push-ups were doled out as punishment. cleaning the toilets with a toothbrush, all of that sort of thing, which is very, very military. And obviously the world's evolved, but it taught you a lesson. And I hated it then, but in hindsight, didn't have a problem with it because I understood the rationale.
So, the one thing I hear when you talk about those sorts of things is, oh, that's very demeaning. How dare people demean you? I look at it in the sense that, okay, maybe cleaning the toilet with a toothbrush is demeaning, but realistically, most people clean the toilet with a big toothbrush anyway. Is it demeaning, or is it sort of getting you used to doing things that are going to upset you?
Yeah, I think the second. I think, and the difference with discipline. When I first joined, you were scared of anyone with the rank of sergeant. Senior sergeants were demigods, inspectors were gods, and that whole paramilitary discipline thing. I think in a policing environment is essential. Because you
Yep.
need to be able to do what the hell you're told to do rather than stand and argue and question, which is something that you develop later. Certainly as an undercover cop, I had to think on my feet and do my own stuff. But in the initial couple of years of policing, you need to understand that you follow orders for a reason.
Yep.
You can certainly question bad orders, but I think a lot of that. Well, I'm very sure that a lot of that disciplined approach is now gone. You cannot
It has, yeah.
be someone's leader and let them do their own thing. It's a bit of a vexed question.
It is. It's a can of worms that we're probably going in a bit of a rabbit hole.
Yeah.
Look, I understand, and you lived through this. I came in afterwards. I was one of the bright, shiny, new recruits who were going to change the police for the better. You lived through the bad old days. The rationale behind it is that if you teach people to follow orders without questioning, then corruption is going to happen because people aren't going to question the orders of those that are above them. They're just going to do. Now, I think there's a difference between following orders and discipline.
Yeah, it depends. I lived in the corrupt environment, and I always say to people, the vast majority of men and women I met and worked with were honest, as I was.
Yep.
Following orders doesn't mean you have to blindly follow corrupt practices. You can certainly push back against that, and I did. My point is more, if you are told to do a particular job in a certain way that is, correct, you need to be able to follow that instruction. Is probably better than following orders. You need to be able to follow instructions on the road as a cop. A sergeant turns up and says, right, you will go here and do this. You go there and do that. What I do know now is that is a lot of younger coppers will argue. And I think that undermines public confidence in a combined paramilitary force.
I think it also it undermines confidence, public confidence, because they see it, but it also undermines the identity of the organisation as well in that regards. So one of the things that we had to do was ethics. So we had to go to university and then to the academy, and we had to do ethics. And the ethics teachers were all about this fact that police are inherently corrupt, that following orders is inherently corrupt, that getting free McDonald's is inherently corrupt. Without really understanding what policing is and what is required in regards to, like you said, if a sergeant turns up and says to you, I want you to go and do this, if you think it's illegal or corrupt, you go, okay, well, why? But you don't go, no, I'm not going to do it if it's not.
Yeah, I think having lived through the Fitzgerald inquiry into corruption, I think the term corrupt was bandied about way too much. Corruption to me was to take money, steal drugs, steal money, so I'd say take money and bribes, engage in practices that weren't ethical, let's throw the word out there, for your own personal gain or the gain of others. Taking a 50% reduction in a McDonald's fast food chain is not corruption because it's clever business on McDonald's behalf because it meant they'd have cops there in areas that were potentially troublesome. The you have the whole conversation again in the rabbit hole about noble cause corruption as well. Because I did the undergrad justice studies degree after the inquiry, and I railed against the generic all police are corrupt, all police are potentially corrupt narrative in a university setting. I was an experienced guy, and I was able to hold my own in an argument or a debate. But what I was more about, as a detective sergeant, I was a tactical operator. I ran teams. My tactical operators would have never dreamt of arguing the point with me if we were engaged on a high-risk raid, a high-risk job, a siege response, whatever, because that's what discipline's all about. And I guess that's more my point. In an emergency situation, you need to have a paramilitary organisation where people will obey orders from an operational perspective. The whole conversation around ethics and corruption is another one. And there were certainly a number of people, and I was one, who railed or pushed back against corrupt offers. So I think that's different from having a disciplined, structured paramilitary force where you need to be able to give orders.
I agree. But I think that the way that we're training police now, from my intake onwards, we've thrown both of them to mean the same thing. And which is why you're getting instances of people, I can remember when I was a senior connie and I had a brand new constable with me, and it was someone was being thrown out of the casino and he was arguing. And, after 35 minutes of standing there trying to convince this guy to leave, I just said to the thing, we don't have time for this. Tell him to leave or arrest him. And he argued with me, well, no, that's not what we've been told we're supposed to do. We're supposed to help people. We're supposed to make them, yes, we are. But if someone's not going to, do you know what I mean? There needs to be a consequence. And I think the way that they're training people by taking that discipline out of the academy is causing the police service or the police force or whatever they're calling it these days more harm, because everything gets lumped together as the one issue.
Yeah, it's a vexed question, isn't it? You want to have police with the ability to operate independently and use discretion to make their own decisions, but you also need to have, as I keep saying, it's a paramilitary armed force. So there needs to be discipline in which people understand that the rank structure's there for a reason, and they do what they're told. Because if someone's firing shots downrange at you, and unfortunately those major things don't happen anymore like they used to before Port Arthur. But I've been to situations, and I've written about them, where I've just turned up and given orders and taken control, and people have responded to the way in which they should have. When you have police officers who decide that, if they have 12 months service, and we all have been there, they have 12 months service, and they know better than a non-commissioned officer, and they start to argue, then that's when discipline breaks down. It's not where policing should be.
No, agreed. All right, let's bring it back to the undercover side of stuff. So, how long were you a police officer before you went into the covert work?
I volunteered for it, and I started it 2 months before I turned 22.
Okay, so 5 years.
No, I was
nearly in 4 years.
Sworn in at 19, so almost 3.
3 years.
Yeah.
Why did you want to do covert work?
There were people dying in droves of heroin overdoses in the late 70s and early 80s, and right up to the late 80s, I think. But heroin was being brought in through pretty unprotected borders. So you talk about corruption, a combination of corrupt customs officials, unprotected borders, corrupt police, all through the country. And the heroin trade was out of control. It was really down to a guy called Terence John Clark with an E, who was a New Zealander, who ran a major international drug syndicate. So the quality of heroin that was coming in from the Golden Triangle was killing people every day, I don't use the term junkies. I use the term addicts. I've seen high functioning addicts in every walk of life. But these young people, predominantly young people, and they were middle class. So heroin use wasn't a lower class drug. It was a middle class drug. And we were finding bodies in toilet cubicles, sometimes on the street, etc., in houses, and just they're horrible. So I was fairly idealistic and naive, and I thought working undercover would be a good way to do something concrete. about the drug trade. And essentially, at that age, you think you can change the world. And that's what I tried to do.
Fair enough.
I didn't realise how much it had changed me.
What was the most difficult thing of working undercover for you?
In spite of my upbringing, I was actually a nice guy. I was empathetic. Yep. I cared about people. I was polite. If I had to react on the street and take someone down in a violent blitz, absolutely I would. But the core of me, I was just a very nice guy. So one of the hardest things was changing that personality and adopting the personality of a mid-level dealer. And so I portrayed myself as a mid-level heroin dealer. And mid-level heroin dealers don't have the manners and the niceness that I'd had normally. So I had to learn and adapt and adopt the mannerisms of others. I had to speak in a certain way that wasn't the norm for me. I had to treat women like crap. I had to, assert a position even at the age of 22 that I was a shaker and a mover, I suppose, in the drug scene. So all of that stuff. One of the hardest things that I ever did was watch a 14-year-old kid be shot up with his first hit of heroin. I thought he was about 17 or 18, but I still couldn't have interfered anyway. And I found out later, about 4 years later, he died of a heroin overdose. And I carried that guilt for quite some time and probably still do.
How do you address that guilt? It's never going to go away, okay? But how did you address that guilt?
Well, when I had my breakdown, I suppose a lot of things had compounded on me. That was one memory that came back, and I've just understood through research and self-awareness and therapy that you can't change what's happened in the past. You just need to, as best you can, accept it, understand it and move through it. And that sounds simplistic, and it's a lot more detailed than that. But, I just look back on it and think, well, what else could I have done? 4 years, when I think about that, I would think about I should have, could have, would have, but it's over and done. It's just been an impact on my life that's one of many trauma.
I guess, look, partially because I've been there, but the first question that comes to mind is, if you'd intervened then, coulda, woulda, shoulda, does that necessarily mean, one, a week later he wasn't going to take a hit somehow, some other way? Two, what would the outcome have been for you, even though the action was noble, so to speak?
Well, I was in the middle of a heroin operation, and I'd been in this particular region for about 3 months. The operation went for 6. So, and I was working by myself. There was no backup. So I don't know what it was like in your time, but in my time, you worked one out and that was it. There were no mobile phones. There were no pages. I didn't wear listening devices very often at all. And I was in a house where no one knew where I was. So, had I intervened, it would have been completely out of character. As I said, I thought he was about 17 or 18.
Unfortunately, that is where we will have to leave part 1 of this interview with Keith Banks. Please be sure to listen to part 2 to find out how Keith dealt with this traumatic experience and a few more interesting discussions. Thank you for listening to Whisper in the Shadows, the interview series, the true stories of real-life undercover police officers. I hope you've enjoyed that episode. In the next episode, we'll explore more exciting stories from undercover cops from around the world. Please make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Lastly, if you're an ex-covert operative or undercover police officer, I would love to chat to you about your experiences. Or, if you're feeling dangerous, tell your stories on my podcast. Please get in contact by my email, which is whisperintheshadowspodcast@gmail.com. I look forward to you joining me next time.